Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Global Affairs Unfiltered. I'm Jack Stockwell, and it is the second day of December, 2025. And today's going to be a very pivotal day in world history because of something momentous that is going on right now in Moscow. And I want to start off with that, and then we'll kind of go through what is happening around the rest of the planet that will directly or indirectly affect you because, as the title of this program is, can our leaders be any more insane? There's no longer a topic for debate. It's quite obvious. It's quite obvious. I don't know how they could be more insane until one of them finally pushes the launch button. And that debate is going on now as to whether or not you can have limited nuclear war. All right, so what I want to start with, again, the spots for me taking care of people at half price are thinning out. It's available through the month of December, and I want to invite you to go to jackstockwell.com and look at an introductory video on what it is I do in my clinic. Oh, excuse me. As to what we do, there's a video, it's just a couple of minutes long, but it explains in more detail how vital an upper cervical correction to the human spine can be in restoring health and healing and stability to the physical structure of the human body, let alone the elimination of pain. jackstockwell.com, and then there's an introductory video on NUCCA, N-U-C-C-A. Stands for National Upper Cervical, meaning the upper neck, Chiropractic Association, because the upper neck controls the entire spine. The research, it's overwhelming. All right, now, oh, excuse me, I just had a drink here before the show started and it went down the wrong pipe in my hurry. If you're just tuning in, my name is Jack Stockwell. You can get more information about me at jackstockwell.com as well as forbiddendoctor.com. I'm in my 31st year of broadcasting in connection with K-Talk Radio. And as I have said a number of times, I do not take this privilege lightly. I deeply appreciate being able to be a part of your morning, representing my viewpoints. Of course, I'm not going to be giving somebody else's viewpoints, unless I quote them, and I quote them from time to time. However, what is going on right now in Moscow, the talks headed by Steve Witkoff with Vladimir Putin. It's interesting that it's Witkoff doing this, not Trump himself. I guess Trump doesn't want to go to Moscow. Makes Moscow that much bigger of a target. But anyway, Putin, in meeting with Witkoff, has just returned from his third visit in 5 weeks to the Special Military Operation Area, which he did this weekend. I think it was Sunday. He came back Sunday, getting ready for his meeting with Witkoff, to take reports from his frontline commanders in the conflict with the Ukrainian regime. And so the military advances of the Russian forces were highlighted this last evening in Russian television and reporting. President Putin visited a command post of the Joint Force, heard reports from the chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, about the liberation of Krasnoyarsk in the DPR and Volchansk in the Kharkov region, as well as about the results of the offensive operations in these other areas. And so Putin said this to his people: I want to thank you for the results of your work regarding Krasnoyarsk. Both you and the entire command and personnel of the battle group, of course, the fighters, our guys who are carrying out these combat missions. Now, the reports Putin took back from the sector commanders, of course, sharply contradicts what Western media is telling you. That Russia is bogged down. Russia can only advance inches a day. And the commander of the battle group center, Valery Solodchuk, reported to Putin about the taking of the southern part of the city of Dmitrov under the control of Russian forces, and about the situation in Krasnoyarsk after it was liberated by our forces. Then General Solodchuk observed that about 2,000 Ukrainian troops remain surrounded in Dmitrov, which is adjacent to Krasnoyarsk, and that his forces, as Putin had requested, were creating conditions for the Ukrainian troops to surrender. You know, you don't just sit there with a bullhorn, surrender or die. You have to make, when you're dealing with 2,000 fighting forces, soldiers, whatever, of the Ukrainian army, you don't just have them lay down their troops and march single file. You have to make arrangements to take care of them. A lot of them are wounded. A lot of them are sick. They're hungry. They're cold. And so, according to humanitarian rules associated with the Geneva Convention, you have to provide something for them, which they are in the process of doing. However, the Ukrainian commanders are blocking the troops from being able to surrender. Oh, excuse me again. Now imagine that you are responsible somewhere up the line for these 2,000 soldiers that are completely encircled by the Russians, who, if they don't surrender, are going to be killed. And you're their commander, and you're telling them not to surrender. Because if you tell them to surrender, you'll be shot. So what do you do to keep them from surrendering? Well, they're blocking their troops, but they're targeting with drones the soldiers who are attempting to surrender. I talked to you about that yesterday. I've talked to you about that in times past. Instead of turning these, and the drones, of course, are all under radio control. So instead of just going after Russian soldiers, they're turning them on their own people if they look like they're going to surrender. So later in this back and forth with Solodchuk discussion regarding such neo-Nazi commanders treating the worker peasant army of these untrained recruits in this fashion, Putin just referred to it as a tragedy of the Ukrainian people. So in response to a report by the commander of the Battle Group East, Andrei Ivaniev, regarding 15 villages that have been liberated in the Zaporizhia and the Dnipropetrovsk regions, and his forces reaching the Gaichur River, Putin said this: "Your troops are advancing at a pace that guarantees the fulfillment of all tasks before us. I mean that with such a pace of our offensive, the adversary, of course, is unable to respond to this properly." Then Ivaniev also announced the units of the 5th Combined Armies were now beginning the operation to liberate the city of Gilipol in the Zaporizhia region. Then the President Putin's website says this: Vladimir Putin thanked the commanders and personnel of all forces for their efficiency and tasked the officers with ensuring the troops have everything they need to continue fighting during the upcoming winter months. Now, I told you all that to say this. Once Putin returned from the front, with all of these advances that are being made, he's going to meet today, and of course they're already meeting. They're about 12 hours ahead of us, 10 hours ahead of us. So it's this evening over there, probably having dinner. That Putin's going to meet with Witkoff after it has been well established what the Russian army is doing in advancing closer and closer to the Dnieper River and taking over these other areas. So what's Witkoff going to be doing? Well, we already, and why is Jared Kushner there? To build another Trump Tower in Moscow? Well, I'm getting off track. What's important here is that in the meeting that's probably over with by now, Putin is probably reporting to Witkoff what's going on, and uh, Putin is probably saying, listen, we've had this discussion many times, going back to the Anchorage meeting. You know our position. Here are the reports of our battle commanders. It's not what the Western press is saying. We're not bogged down. We're not getting our butts kicked. We're not losing 100,000 soldiers every time we turn around. In fact, the numbers go the other direction. So show me your cards, Mr. Witkoff. Steve, old buddy, old pal, show me your cards. Let's see who's going to clean the pot here. So this last 24 hours of all the diplomatic and military stuff that's going on is reaching its crisis point today. That's why today is so important, even though we're hours, half a day behind Russia. So with Trump's representatives there, and as I said, included Kushner, it's been widely reported, usually sourced as some unnamed anonymous senior official, that the matters of territory and of an election had not been accepted by Kyiv, which is part of the 28 plan, and they were on the U.S. agenda for this meeting that took place November 30th between Ukraine and the United States in Florida. Then a half-hour discussion was held Sunday at the golf club developed by Witkoff, the Shell Bay Club in Hollandale Beach, Florida, with Rubio and Kushner present, with a large Ukrainian delegation headed by the National Security and Defense Council, Rustem Umerov, and including the head of Ukraine's armed forces. I mean, this is a power-packed meeting. This took place Sunday in Florida between Rubio and Kushner, not Witkoff, but it was at Witkoff's golf club with this very powerful military group from the Ukraine sitting down, talking about what's going to happen before Witkoff's meeting with Putin today. Now, a couple of people were missing from this meeting, Yermak and the others that have been forced out of their position because of the embezzlement scandal that's going on. But at this media briefing, and then Rubio's there. This is the funny thing about it. On the one hand, you have the president and Witkoff, and you have the new Secretary of the Army. His name escapes me for a minute. Pushing to get this 28-point plan passed to stop the killing in the Ukraine. And on the other hand, you have Rubio, Secretary of State, who's broken away from Trump and is pushing for the war along with his buddies, Lindsey from South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, and some other traitorous members of the Senate, to push even further for long-range missiles to be delivered to the Ukraine that would only be 5 minutes away from Moscow on launch, as well as to attack Venezuela in the south. Is this any different than it was 20 years ago? Is it any different than it was 40 years ago? Is it any different since the end of World War II, as far as our foreign policies are concerned? This stuff has been going on for such a long time. We were warned by Eisenhower about the military-industrial complex, a shadow government that exists inside of our government, the deep state, you want to call it a bunch of different names, but it's there, it's alive, it's breathing, it's kicking, and it's control of all of this stuff. So the Russians know this. The Russians know this much more than the average American citizen by large amount. And so you have Putin on the battleground, on the front lines, meeting with his generals who are moving kilometers a day, not inches a day. And remember, Ukraine is the largest country next to Russia of the entire Eurasian area, except for China, of course. I mean, it's huge. It's bigger than Texas. And so it takes a while to recover all of this land. And so Putin comes back proudly with his reports from his frontline commanders as to the cities they've been taking over and what's next. Then he sit down today with Witkoff and to say, all right, here it is. Show me your cards. What are you going to do? Because the future of all of this is very clear. It's a matter of attrition. So we sit down and we sign things now to end this, one of which is to end Zelensky. He's got to be out of the picture. We don't recognize Zelensky as having any authority to represent Ukraine. His presidency was over with May of 2024, and then when he declared a dictatorship, he's been a dictator of Ukraine ever since, not president, not an elected president anyway. And so what's happening now, it's not just about terms that ends the fighting. It's about terms that will set up the Ukraine for some long-term prosperity, because the end goal is obviously not to just end the war, but it's also about securing an end to the war that leaves Ukraine sovereign and independent with an opportunity to recover itself with real prosperity. So it wasn't surprising that yesterday Umerov and Witkoff met again, including a five-way phone call with Ukraine's acting President Zelensky, France's President Macron, UK Prime Minister Starmer, and Zelensky saying this on the five-way call that was released by the press just now, together with Emmanuel Macron, Keir Starmer. We spoke with Rustem Umerov and Steve Witkoff following the talks in Florida. Then after the five-way call, Zelensky, Macron, and Starmer reported back to the larger coalition of the willing bloc of leaders of several nations, plus NATO and the EU. And it was notable just yesterday that Zelensky was still talking about his coming meeting with President Trump. And he said, we're expecting a conversation with the President of the United States on key issues that are quite challenging. On key issues that are quite challenging. Yeah, like the Russians' position, no NATO in Ukraine, demilitarization of the Ukraine down to maybe 80,000 soldiers, the elimination of the last of the Nazis in the Kyiv government, and the fact that the Russians will keep the territories that they've gained. So that would be the key issues that are quite challenging. On December 1st, there was a short-lived rumor that Zelensky would get a personal visit today in Ireland from Witkoff, but I haven't been able to find any confirmation of that. So much is not known, but it is not to be doubted that a long-awaited public recognition in Kyiv that 4 regions ceded 3 years ago voted to join Russia and are largely under Russian military protection is, as Zelensky said, quite challenging, as is the matter of an open election in Ukraine that Zelensky has stopped from happening. Plus, over the last 24 hours, the fall of Pokrovsk and other losses is not going to prove Zelensky's popularity in Ukraine by any means. All right, now I was going to go into the latest craziness coming out of Sanae Takaichi, the new Japanese prime minister, for her conversations with NATO Secretary Rudy about constructing a global NATO. And that they want the Japanese diet, what, six weeks ago, I think, with there are oligarchs in Tokyo, in Japan, like there are oligarchs in Wall Street and other parts of the country that have such tremendous financial power, that they're the ones who are really guiding the government. And some of these oligarchical backers of Takaichi in Japan are imperialists who want to restore the military greatness of Japan, as was evidenced the first half of the previous century. And so she was speaking to the Diet, the Japanese parliament, about tearing up the 1945 treaties that ended World War II, that required Japan to adopt a constitution as a pacifist nation, and instead seeking to recreate Japan in its glorious form of its warmongering imperial past, especially against China. So in a recent move, Japan is now conferring on placing missiles in the Philippines. So this is definitely heating up the situation between Japan and China, because China is not going to allow that any more than Russia is going to allow missiles in the Ukraine. That's why I titled the program today, Can Our Leaders Be Any More Insane? So Tokyo, according to the Global Times, as of Sunday, citing Japan's Kyodo News, said Tokyo, quote, Tokyo is holding informal consultations with the Philippines over the sale of Japan's Type 03 medium-range surface-to-air missiles in the Philippines. The Type 03 has a range of 50 kilometers and is designed for air defense roles, capable of engaging targets, aircraft, helicopters, and cruise missiles. Just at a time when things could be cooling off, slowing down, reversing gears a little bit in the Ukraine, things are speeding up on the other side of the world, where they're trying to get a global NATO underway. Now, on top of all of this, Japan has reported its plan to export 6 used Abakuma class destroyer escorts to the Philippines. Well, this is war buildup, exactly of the form that a global NATO would try to seek to unleash on the world. This is just something else. Do you know what source of production income was the greatest during 2024? Global arms sales, benefiting from demand driven by the wars in Ukraine and Gaza and the confrontation with China, reached a record $679 billion last year, according to a report released yesterday by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Said global arms rose sharply in 2024 as demand was boosted by the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, global and regional geopolitical tensions, and even higher military expenditures. For the first time since 2018, all of the 5 largest arms companies increased their arms revenues. So, the major arm producers, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamic, there were widespread delays. Budget overruns continue to plague developments and production of U.S.-led programs such as the F-35 combat aircraft, the Columbia-class submarine, and the Sentinel intercontinental ballistic missile. Several of the USA's largest arms producers, and this is nothing new, constantly plagued by overruns, raising uncertainty about when major new weapon systems and upgrades to existing ones can be delivered and deployed. But that's not what's happening in Russia. Russia is turning out Oreshnik missiles, the Poseidon submarines, or torpedoes, and the Oreshnik missile, the new one. Just madness. Just madness. Most people are aware that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is a consequence of NATO's eastward expansion and its deployment of offensive weapon systems around Russia. And Russia's early warning time can be as short as 5 minutes. And from the perspective of Russia's national security, this is unacceptable. Now, the Baltic countries that have missiles on the ground, especially Latvia, borders Russia. Latvia just isn't that far from St. Petersburg. It's not that far from Moscow. And so as NATO continued to move further east, the Russians have had a war building program going on for some time now to counter this move by NATO. And so the strategic picture right now is just maximum tension, maximum dangers, maximum potentials, but it does require our constant attention to what people who are in leading positions are saying, that you have to consider the fact that we are being run by madmen. A recent example is this Italian admiral, Giuseppe Cavo Dragoni, he's chair of the NATO Military Committee. And he claims that as a response to the Russian cyber warfare activities in the Baltic Sea, which are maintained but not proven, that NATO should consider a preemptive strike against Russia. He just said that this weekend. And generally more aggressive action, which should be considered, he said, a defensive action. If we were to do, he said, if we were to do an initial first strike against Russia, it would actually be a defensive move on our part. So we can't be accused of an offensive action. Even though we attack them, it would be defensive on our part. Now, obviously, a preemptive strike against the largest nuclear power on the planet would virtually ensure escalation to a nuclear war. And therefore is one good reason why I think people like Giuseppe here need to be shown the door, told to go home and shut up. This is clearly a threat potential, which is definitely insane. If you look at the various scenarios and situations around this planet, you cannot turn off the red alert sign, because any one of these situations can blow up in a matter of minutes, a matter of hours, to global conflagration. Let's start with the situation in Venezuela, where Trump had a phone call with Maduro. And while Trump says he does not want to say what the content was, the news media is reporting that the U.S. has given Maduro an ultimatum to go into exile, possibly to Moscow, and in that way escape a fate which otherwise is surely awaiting you. Also, the United States has basically closed the Venezuelan airspace, and Venezuela emphatically has rejected this as an illegal colonialist attack on its sovereignty. The Venezuelan Foreign Ministry put out a statement saying, "The colonialist threat aimed at undermining our sovereignty." Now, as many observers have noted, you don't bring up such an enormous military force as the one that is currently deployed in the Caribbean right now and then do nothing but fish off the bow of the aircraft carrier. How many feet does that bow sit above the water? It's more than 100 feet, isn't it? You don't have a flotilla like that's associated here with the size of this aircraft carrier, the largest one on the planet, and the 11 ships that goes with it, destroyers and otherwise, to just sit there for an afternoon's day in the sun. Otherwise, the situation in the Ukraine is clearly coming to an end one way or the other very soon. European leaders in panic. They're still full of all kinds of delusional thinking as delusion slips from their lips daily. They reject the plans being discussed between the U.S. and Ukraine and Russia. You notice when they had their meetings in Doha and when they had their meetings in Riyadh, the European leaders were not invited. It was the American delegation and the Russian delegation. Now, the meeting that was going on today, probably over, as I said, between Witkoff and Putin, did not include any of the Western leaders. They're completely unwilling to recognize that it was NATO's move eastward that caused this whole dilemma in the first place. And therefore, their insistence that Ukraine should join NATO only shows you that they are completely unwilling to recognize their mistakes, despite the fact that many warnings about NATO policies were given. One was by U.S. Ambassador William Burns in 2008 under Trump or under Bush, when he warned, he said that if the Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, that will lead to war with Russia. How long ago was that? 25, 8, 17 years ago. Then George Kennan presciently had warned in 1997 under Clinton that expanding NATO would be the most fateful error in American policy in the entire Cold War era. And then naturally the Minsk Accord, if it had not been sabotaged by the Europeans, would have avoided this conflict because it had proposed autonomy of the ethnic Russian regions of Donetsk and Luhansk within a federated state of Ukraine. It would still be Ukraine, you just have to stop killing the ethnic Russians. Coupled with an understanding that Ukraine would never join NATO. And as we now know, Merkel and Hollande and Poroshenko said that they never intended to stick with the Minsk Accords. It was just a dodge to use the time to build the Ukrainian forces to a NATO level. Kind of a reverse Cuban Missile Crisis is what the situation now is. And I find it quite noteworthy that the China Central Television, that reaches tens of millions of viewers, are now being fed this information daily over the TV that we don't get here in this country. What we get here in this country is extremely edited information. So Putkov, the Putkov meeting, Putin and Witkoff meeting today. This was announced by Peskov. Then there was this, as I said, this meeting yesterday in Florida, which included Umarov, the Ukrainian representative, plus Witkoff and Kushner, and they met at the Shell Bay Club, which is Witkoff's private golf club. Also in attendance, Andrei Huntov, the head of the Ukrainian chief of the general staff, Deputy Foreign Minister Kylitsya, Ambassador to the U.S., Ohal Stefanishina, and President Advisor Alexander Bebs, who also used to be Yermak's advisor. And what comes to be read with a grain of salt is this article in the Wall Street Journal, the headline of which is, "Make Money, Not War. Trump's Real Plan for Peace in the Ukraine," end quote. So the Kremlin pitched the White House on peace through business. Now, to Europe's dismay, the president and his envoy are on board with this. And what they report is that these three powerful businessmen, two Americans and a Russian, agreed on talking in the waterfront estate of the billionaire developer turned special envoy Stephen Witkoff, hosting Kirill Dmitriev in the presence of Jared Kushner. And they discussed, among other things, a plan where the United States companies would tap into roughly $300 billion of the Russian central bank assets frozen in Europe for the U.S.-Russian investment projects and the U.S.-led reconstruction of the Ukraine. And the U.S. and Russian companies would join to exploit the vast mineral wealth in the Arctic. And there would be no limits to what the two-term adversaries could achieve. Dmitriev argued for months their rival space industries could even pursue a joint mission to Mars with Elon Musk's SpaceX. This is what they're talking about. This is what they were talking about in Anchorage. Because it's a foregone conclusion that the war is essentially over with. It's just the cleaning up that takes place. Ukraine lost. Russia won. Russia's making vast movements towards the Dnieper River right now. And the voice, the words, the discussion coming out of Putin's mouth, for which he should get the Nobel Peace Prize, I think, is just patience. Just, do what you got to do, but try to limit the slaughter, try to limit the decimation of the civilian infrastructure. Be careful. Do what you have to do to protect the troops, but be careful. And by the way, we're meeting with the Americans on a joint mission to Mars. We're meeting with the Americans on a joint mission to develop Siberia. We have great technology, we have great engineering, but so do the Americans. And the Americans see the potential of the development of Siberia. So we're meeting with them. So when you heard of meetings over the last few months taking place between America and the Russian leadership, and you thought, not you, K-Talk listeners, you were smarter than this, but the rest of America thought they were talking about how to end the war. It's like, how do I eat this dinner that I've already eaten? So it's a little, behind the ball. The war's over. They don't have to talk about how they're going to end the war. Russia has already made it clear what their demand will be. But as I said, they're not giving up the territories. There will be no NATO in the UK or in Ukraine. And the Nazis have got to go. If not, we'll find them and put them at the end of a rope. That is not discussable. That cannot be a part of the discussion hereafter. That's the way things are. So now that we've spent 10 minutes here in Anchorage discussing the end of the war that's already in momentum now, let's talk about what's going to happen after this is over with. You Americans like investments. You Americans like making money. We Russians like our engineering, our investments. We like making money. What can we do together as business partners? And as more of that information leaks out, it is just pissing off the Western leaders even more, to where one of the military commanders of the NATO forces is saying we should do a limited strike now against Russia. That's why I said these people are crazy. So obviously, I started off talking about this money. The difficulty here is that the $300 billion in Russian central bank assets presently are frozen in a Belgian account. So how they want to access that is not entirely clear, but that's what the Wall Street Journal just wrote this weekend. And it would drive the Europeans crazy because they had counted on squeezing and stealing that money for themselves. And they're completely unwilling to recognize this changed reality. For example, von der Leyen, poor woman, is pretending she still commands the whole European Union, which she isn't, and she can't. Merz thinks he has a strong economy, but he doesn't. Macron believes that because France is a nuclear power, he has support, but he does not in the population. Macron's support in the French population is worse than Biden after the Biden interview. Macron's around 8%. He's still the leader. One of the weaknesses of parliamentary government. Keir Starmer is equally delusional. And Kaja Kallas, second to von der Leyen, who comes from Estonia. which has a minority of not even 0.3% of the European population, can't shut her big mouth. So they obviously do not want to recognize that this situation is completely lost. Ukraine has lost the war of attrition. They don't have the troops to resupply the front. There's no way they have any chance of reconquering lost territory because they can't hold on to the territory they're on. So it's clearly not in favor of anybody who wants to continue this war. Ray McGovern, who somebody I listen to every time he opens his mouth, has an article in which he says Trump holds the cards to end this war. And he quotes Trump saying that it's clearly up to the Russians and it's moving in a good one direction, which is that's land that over the next couple of months might be gotten by Russia anyway. So here's Trump's analysis and philosophy of this is, and it's one of the few things that's come out of his mouth lately I can actually agree with. Do you want to keep fighting, or do you want to lose another 50, 60,000 people? Or do you want to do something now? How hard is that to understand? But when it goes to the coalition of the willing, who believe the Russian army is bogged down, the Russian economy is falling apart, the Russian population wants Putin thrown out, when some of the most reliable sources and polling show he has 80% approval of his people, even after the 200,000-300,000 dead Russian soldiers so far. He has 80% approval of his people. And so Trump comes along and says, listen, the territories that Russia is moving into now is going to be theirs in another month or two. Do you want to stop them where they're at now and save another 50 to 60,000 Ukrainian soldier lives? Or do you just want to let it go till it runs out? And they're negotiating this. Yeah, but what's in it for us? They're trying to get it done. So Trump has that approach. So does Secretary of the Army, Daniel Driscoll, who told the Ukrainians that the war is over. In Kyiv, he tells them face to face, listen, this war is over. You got to do something now. And then, of course, Zelensky continues to play his role. More money, more money. With more money, we can buy more weapons. No, with more money, they can pay off more people so that your tax dollars are equally distributed around the planet in stolen, embezzled money that was supposed to go to Ukrainian troops, but it's going to all these different people who got their hands on it. Remember that pallet of cash that was delivered to Iran? Where'd that money go? So you have a battle in which the U.S. neocons, and we've got some really good ones, starting with Rubio, and the Europeans on one side, and then you got Trump and his faction on the other. And Ray McGovern concludes his article by saying that Trump really holds the cards to end this, but will he do it? Now, I would think that the meeting that's probably over, I don't know if it's going to go more than one day, between Witkoff and Putin, that is certainly going on now, will tell us a lot more. Putin and Orban met just the end of last week, and they agreed not only will Hungary get a cheaper energy source from Russia, but Orban declared that he is still absolutely ready to offer Budapest as the site for the continuous negotiations. The access to the frozen Russian assets is still a big question. Belgium so far has blocked the plan of the EU to use the first tranche, 185 billion, frozen in the foreign exchange, the what's called the Bourse Euroclear in Brussels, because the prime minister claims he wants ironclad guarantees that if the EU, that if these monies are taken, that the entire EU is giving the guarantee, because otherwise Belgium has to pay for all of it, which the EU so far has not agreed to do. So one has to see how that plays out. But Belgium is saying, well, before we even think about letting you have this money, we have to have guarantees that you're going to back it up. Well, where in the European Union do they have 185 billion in case that money doesn't go to the Ukraine? The same thing happens to that money that happens to the money we send to the Ukraine, gets spread around in the corruption scandal people. So all of this obviously has international ramifications, because when the Ukraine war ends, you're going to have a lot of disgruntled people who have lost everything, absolutely everything. And you're going to have a refugee flood of biblical proportions because the country of Ukraine has been destroyed. And then Trump, a couple of things about him. After these 2 National Guard members were shot in Washington, he put out a statement saying that the animal, not terrorist, not man, not human, the animal that had shot the 2 National Guard members has shot these people, and they are now severely injured. And of course, one died. The other one apparently has just the slightest positive improvement. But the fact that Trump would call people, even if they are murderers, to call them animals is not exactly something one can agree with, because the distinction between human beings and animals is there, even if the human beings are murderers and the animals are not. So the situation is that the shooter was not just an Afghan, that he had been trained. First of all, he came to the United States in 2021. He'd been trained for 10 years working with U.S. Special Forces in Kandahar. He was a soldier who had been trained by the Americans. It's a case an awful lot like bin Laden, where people who have been working with the United States, then the United States turns against them and they become terrorists of all sorts. And this does not forebode well, because there's going to be a lot of people, once the war is finished, that were mercenaries who had been working with Latin American drug cartels. That's where their pay money is coming from. Even though they're fighting in the Ukraine, they're being paid by Latin American drug cartels for the military occupying and governing, supervising of drug movements. Look the other way. It's just another facet of the deep state and these special ops and the black money. And some of them have been shot or arrested, these mercenaries, but many of them are going back after getting top-notch training in the war in Ukraine, now as members of these cartels. They're going back to train the other members of the cartel fighting force that didn't get the blessed privilege of spending a few months in the Ukraine fighting the Russians. Oh, what a movie. What a movie this would be. Well, what a movie it is making. So the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute put out new figures that show that in 2024, the 100 top weapons producers worldwide increased their profits to $679 billion, a 6% increase over the previous year. Naturally, some of them made significantly larger increases than that, but that destruction of the real economy continues. One of the major investments that you could possibly make right now is in the war makers, the armament people. Also, part of that is that when the German government stopped prohibiting the export of weapons to Israel, arguing that since the ceasefire there would be a stabilized situation, which obviously is completely ridiculous, because 1,000 people so far have died since the so-called ceasefire was established. The Palestinians have been put into a tiny, hardly livable area, while the IDF now has 58% of Gaza under its control. And the Knesset is...
Folks have no idea what honey and cinnamon can do for your brain. I'm 82 years old, and just a few months ago...
What the heck? Sorry. What the heck is that? Was that a station ID? Sorry about that. So, just like the West Bank, the Knesset is preparing legally everything else they illegally, the permanent annexation of the Gaza into Israel. And the big scandal is that the various Arab news media reporting on footage, which was actually from the IDF soldiers themselves, in which the execution of Palestinians is clearly seen, totally unarmed people being shot at random. Where are these videos coming from? Well, the Arab news media says these videos are being uploaded to us by IDF soldiers who can no longer live with what they're doing. That's a risk, isn't it? If I took a video and I uploaded it to, say, KSL, unless I took steps to VPN or I took steps to encode or whatever else, the authorship of that video, they would know it came from me. And the military would be knocking down my door in the middle of the night, hauling me out to places unknown to remain thereafter unknown. But these videos of the horrible, absolute horrible treatment of Palestinians is coming from IDF soldiers. And I don't know if you saw that video, and I wasn't going to talk about it because I'm afraid I would break down into tears. The video of the little girl in her tent, Palestinian, 3 or 4 years old. She knows that the camera, the phone is photographing her. And she's so excited about her hair. And in a 100% feminine expression of the female nature, this little 4-year-old girl is turning her head side to side, looking into the camera, fluffing up her hair, just as the missile hits her tent. Somehow the camera survived. Over 1,000 since the ceasefire are dead among the Palestinians. Then this new conflict, which has taken a very serious turn for the worse, is this new tension between Japan and China. And to top it off, Takichi telephoned with Mark Rutte, in charge of NATO. She reiterated that again, here's some more of the insanity. She said that the Euro-Atlantic aspect of NATO was no more important than the Indo-Pacific relationship with NATO. They're inseparable, they're interconnected, and the cooperation between Japan and the new NATO IP4. When you hear NATO, you know you're talking Europe. When you hear NATO IP4, you're talking Japan, Australia, mighty fighting force of New Zealand, and Korea. And this is all strategically important. Rutte confirmed so that this is the whole expansion of global NATO. which they clearly have in mind. But on the bottom of that new conflict is that after Taikichi had met with Trump in Korea, also after the meeting with her and Xi Jinping, she would have a little bit more balanced view, one would think. On November 7th, she said if China would use any military force on Taiwan, this would constitute a survival threatening situation for Japan, and that would open up the possibility of armed intervention in the Taiwan Strait. Well, this obviously been answered by very sharp attacks by China. And then, as if to rub salt in the wound, she declared that under the Treaty of the San Francisco Peace, Japan is not in a position to recognize Taiwan's legal status. That is also a complete reversal of history, because in the Cairo Treaty from 1943, it was stated very clearly that all the territories stolen by Japan from China, such as Northeast China, Taiwan, the Penghu Islands, would be restored to China. And the One China policy was established with that, and it was confirmed in the July 1945 Potsdam Declaration that that policy is international law. So for her to revoke the Cairo Treaty, the Potsdam Declaration, the San Francisco Treaty, can only be read by the Chinese as an effort by Japan to go back to the days of their old imperial policy, where Japan rules that part of the world. One should not forget that the losses China suffered in the Second World War, about 35 million Chinese, even more severe than the 27 million the Soviet Union lost. Therefore, the memory of that suffering, including the Nanjing Massacre, which was quite amazing demonstration of brutality and killing on the part of imperialist Japan, is still very alive in the memory of both the Russians with the Great Patriotic War, as well as the Chinese. So Taikichi is clearly playing with fire. And there is now the big question mark. This all happened right after she met with Trump. Did she get the tacit agreement from Trump when she met with him in South Korea? Because Trump subsequently said that she should cool it. I think he said that last week. She should cool it, what she's saying. But naturally, people do question that if she would dare to challenge China in this way without U.S. backing, I don't know that anybody comes out and makes statements like this unless they have good, strong U.S. backing. But anyway, her popularity in China is just going through the ceiling. But she's got to back down. So this is all increasing the depth and the scope of the Russia-Chinese partnership. We're coming up here towards the end. Lowell will be taking over here in a few minutes. Again, I want to announce that the half-price special at my office. Man, I'll tell you, if you're feeling run down, if you're overcome with vertigo, headaches, migraines, neck pain that just never goes away, you wake up in the morning with a stiff neck, you wake up in the morning and you can't get out of bed without extra effort, and it takes 10 minutes of walking around before you even start to move freely, you need me. Now or later, but you're going to need me, one or the other. Later, it's going to take more work. But that's my specialty. You call 801-523-1890. 801-523-1890 to make an appointment. The appointment is for a 30-minute consultation. It's absolutely free. There's no charge unless you want me to take care of you. But what I've been seeing lately is a lot of low back pain, a lot of sciatica, a lot of knee pain, hip pain. And once the body's architecture is reestablished into a balanced state, those things just disappear in a matter of hours to days, because they're compensatory pain for the body being out of alignment relative to gravity. That's all. How did it get that way? Some kind of a fall, some kind of an accident. Could have happened 50 years ago. The body's still paying for it. Okay, I am going to shut down the stream. Thank you for those who are part of today's program. Like and subscribe if you can. And I will be back tomorrow with a health show on a lot of